The rain began as a whisper, a soft hiss against the roof that blurred the edges of the world. Streetlights smeared into braided ribbons of gold and sodium, and the highway seemed to tilt toward the horizon. The first story begins with a man who should have kept driving. He was hours into a night shift, headlights cutting through curtain-like sheets of water. The road had become a black mirror, and he took comfort in small rituals: the hum of the radio, a lukewarm coffee balanced in the cup holder, the steady sway of wipers. Then, in a pool of light on the shoulder, he saw an umbrella standing like a thin, bloody flag. Beside it, two small shoes faced the road. They were delicate, scuffed at the toes, the kind that suggested someone small had walked in but not frequently. He slowed, curse softened, and eased the car onto the gravel. Rain hammered his jacket as he walked toward them, and the world smelled of river and mold. He reached for the shoes, and his fingers brushed fabric that did not sit like cloth should. It felt preserved, cooled in a way that suggested immersion. A faint sweetness cut across the rain, flowers left too long in a vase, and then, for the briefest of seconds, a tall hunched shape moved between the trees, watching. He called the number for roadside assistance and then, with the flat hum of the town on his phone, dialed 911. The operator asked him to stay put. He huddled by his car and tried to make himself smaller than the rain, but he kept looking back at the shoes, at the way the rain tricked along their soles. When officers finally arrived, they found only the shoes and a shallow set of footprints that led away across wet earth and then stopped at a culvert where water roared and swallowed sound. The trace of a child's step vanished into a lace of drainage and gone. The driver spoke afterward of waking sometimes to imagine wet shoes sliding across his apartment floor, of a quiet tapping that followed thunder. Months later, when a neighbor vanished on that same stormy stretch, the driver could not help but imagine the shoes waiting, patient and arranged, an invitation for someone who would answer. The second story clung to a house the way ivy clung to brick. A Victorian with windows like dark eyes, it had been left to memory and rumors. The new owner arrived with a camera and plans to catalog peeling paint, expecting domestic complaints, pipes, drafts, the occasional skitter of mice. But the noises he got were clever and intimate. At midnight a lullaby hummed beneath the floorboards like someone reciting a name under their breath. The tune moved around the rooms as if whoever sang knew the house by memory. He pried up a loose attic plank and found a pocket in the dark, a cramped hollow with a blanket matted with damp, a tin toy with its paint flaking away, and the faint impression of a child's presence. He closed the plank and told himself that was enough. But the house wanted more. Each night the humming changed like a voice trying on a new face. Tiny, wet handprints appeared on the inside of windows as though a small palm had pressed the glass to watch the rooms. Once he found a scrap of paper tucked beneath his pillow with half letters and crooked lines that looked like someone testing how to write his name. He called relatives and a local historian who told stories, an old nanny who vanished, a child who slipped from a window, and the explanations fit neatly into rumor. The nights, however, refused tidy closure. The lullaby occasionally included his name in a slur that didn't sound right, as if the house had misheard him and learned how to call. Tokens began to appear, a thread from a sweater, a pressed flower from a roadside, crumbs arranged as if part of a child's game. When officers inspected, they found nothing that fit a clean narrative, just signs of a presence that had developed homework in the woodwork, small rehearsed acts, the placing of a toy under a stair, a soft dragging that moved through the crawlspace. He slept with the attic hatch closed but woke to the sound of breath that did not belong to him and to the impression that someone small was still counting the rooms while he lay awake and counted the hours. The third tale unfolded on a city bus that pushed through rain-darkened streets with passengers spread like tired punctuation marks. She boarded after a late diner shift, bone-weary, and took the last available seat by the window where the glass ran in streaks of neon. People dozed under the bus's fluorescent hum. There was a man in a blue coat 2 rows up who seemed to sleep, folded over, but there was something wrong with his stillness. When the bus choked and stalled beneath an overpass, the lights blinked, and a hush became a kind of pressure. The man shifted closer between stops with an almost clinical patience. She felt the hair on her arms lift as his head turned to face her, not with annoyance but with a smile that spread thin and too wide, like a photograph melted by heat. He did not stand to get off. His shape blurred and then was not there. When the bus revived, there remained a dark, damp ring on the vinyl where he had been, as if something had sat and left its memory. Passengers later described uncanny touches, a warm press at the back of the neck, the sensation that someone had adjusted the blanket on a sleeping passenger, a quiet scent of wet wool that couldn't be traced. The surveillance camera that covered the aisle recorded static for precisely 6 minutes, during which the man had appeared and then vanished. Commuter forums warmed with stories, wet crescents on seats, drinks knocked over by no visible cause, and the shared unease of traveling under persistent rain. She stopped taking late buses when she could and learned the adage that storms make mirrors of people. In the wet geometry of the night, certain attentions are exaggerated and cannot be explained away by tiredness. The fourth story takes place in a roadside motel where rain turns neon into a low buzzing hymn. He checked in because the road had become a sheet of glass and the idea of sleeping in his car felt raw. The clerk slid a key across without looking up. The room smelled of bleach, cheap perfume, and the kind of tired that belongs to carpets. He showered, and when the mirror fog cleared for a moment, it showed a face over his shoulder, an instant too close and then gone. When the curtain dried, ink smudges appeared that formed letters, "Don't leave." He laughed violently at first and blamed tired teens or a bored housekeeper. But the manager told a softer, older story. A man had once checked into the room during a ferocious storm and never walked. That evening the motel cameras had a gap, a 6-minute dead zone that matched his check-in. He left at dawn and drove until the rain softened, thinking he had collected only a memory. Later, when he unzipped his backpack, he found a motel key tied to a zipper with the motel's stamp still warm as if pressed into his day. When he returned home, he found a child's shoe tread pressed into the thin dust on his apartment threshold, an imprint too deliberate to be accidental. He replaced the lock on his door that same day and left the key at a drawer where it would not be mistaken for everyday items. Yet sometimes in the deep rain he imagined that small tread shifting toward his bed and woke with his heart pounding, listening for the soft, patient patience of someone who keeps score in small things. The fifth story lives in a forest that swallows the sound of footsteps and makes maps out of muddy prints. Two friends set out on a ridge trail despite the weather, hunching through pine rain and the particular smell of wet earth. Their GPS malfunctioned and the marked path unraveled into sketches. They took shelter beneath a rocky outcrop where water streamed over mineral faces and made the world into a slow-motion wash. When the storm eased, the pair found a circle of prints in the mud around their shelter, small, meticulous, paced in a ring like someone tracing a ritual. They laughed at first, because laughter is a mask for fear, and one wandered off to follow the prints into the trees. Hours later, only one returned. He came back with a jacket snagged on a branch and eyes that had swallowed too much quiet. The missing friend's scarf was found looping around a low stump as if tied by hands that had gone then. Search parties scoured for days and found no body, only a widening ring of prints that suggested repetition. Someone had formed a pattern and repeated it until it grew into a map that made no sense. Over time the zone around the outcrop accrued a folklore. Hikers told of a place where the ground sometimes displayed the imprint of a small procession, a ring that seemed to grow after storms, and of a sound like little feet tapping slowly under the brush. That ring of prints made the earth feel watched the same way wind makes a house feel listened to. The sixth tale is small and particular in its cruelty. A woman cutting through a park to shave minutes off a commute found a child's umbrella inverted in the wet grass, a tiny mitten placed atop it like an offering. She bent to pick it up and felt the mitten's fabric still warm from being handled. She ran home and reported it to the local watch. Officers walked the park in the morning and found no footprints, no disturbed grass, just the memory of a small object arranged like a message. That night, awake and listening, she heard a tapping at the pane in the cadence of a nursery rhyme she used to sing to a niece. Curtains brushed as if touched from the inside. She fled to a neighbor and returned at dawn with the neighbor and a camera. On the stoop, wet and neat, another child's umbrella rested against the door and a small mitten lay on the mat as if someone had left it in plain sight to prove they could. The items were later logged by forensics and sometimes produced fragments, fibers that did not match local reports, hair that yielded no match in any missing person database. Other times they yielded nothing at all, like promises kept only by their author. The woman began to walk home in groups on rainy nights. She slept with a light on and a phone in her hand, and once when she tried to live differently, She found a small umbrella propped inside a potted plant near her window, as if someone had practiced being subtle and then failed. The 7th story centers on a tow operator called before dawn to retrieve a car stalled on a slick shoulder. The owner inside was hysterical, wet and stammering, and on the passenger seat lay a scrap of paper with initials scrawled in the corner, DN. The operator, tired and practical, kept the scrap because it had the scent of damp ink and because such things accumulate into patterns. He drove to the address on the scrap and found an old mill by a river where rain had turned brick into soft tooth. On the sill someone had arranged objects like offerings, a child's shoe, a faded toy car, a scarf looped with a care that felt ritual. Under them a short note read watch, and in the corner the initials, DN. Detectives unfolded that thin ribbon into a series of small files. The initials appeared again and again, pinned into the periphery of storms, tucked into a folded jacket, written on a motel receipt, tied to a tree in the park. Objects were not so much trophies as bookmarks. They marked a thing's presence in time and space, like a practiced hand leaving the simplest flag, I was here. Officers found these artifacts in different towns and different years, and the string of finds read less like the work of a single identifiable culprit than like a language used by someone patient enough to learn what storms erase and what storms reveal. Rain does things to the mind. It blurs the outlines of certainty and makes small details excruciatingly sharp by contrast. These 7 nights collect like stones in a pocket, each cold and heavy, each a memory that will not be shaken loose. Some tales ended in disappearance and others in notes or keys that turned up in impossible places. The common bone is this: rain softens the world's edges, and when someone practices patient attention in that softened space, small acts become maps of control. Footprints in mud, a child's shoe on the shoulder, a lullaby breathed beneath the floor, all of these became instruments to change the way people passed through the day and how they slept at night. Months became a kind of weather too. Survivors measured their years by the smell of wet earth and how many storms came after the first night. The driver who had found the shoes began to take different routes, making a life of small detours to avoid that stretch of road. Still, at times when rain hammered the windshield with a certain insistence, he imagined a tiny foot nudging the rubber of his mat. He learned to carry a small stone in his pocket, something to turn in his fingers at night, because ritual can feel like insurance. The man who lived with lullabies under his floor replaced photographs, bolted hatches, and recorded nights on a cheap device. Sometimes the recordings captured only silence and static, and sometimes the faintest hint of humming replied. The commuter avoided late buses and learned to walk home when she could. She carried a small recorder and played back fragments of white noise until she convinced herself there was pattern. Room keys turned up in the strangest places, stitched into coat lining, folded into books, tucked into cereal boxes. The keys were talismans of presence. They taught people how porous their lives could be. Neighbors began to leave lights on in hedgerows and to post watches during storms. Umbrellas left on stoops were catalogued and photographed. Sometimes they produced traces, fibers or hair that led to no answers, just more questions. The tow operator kept a scrap of paper in his wallet and could not tell if DN were initials, an acronym, or a ritual mark. He knew only that rain made attention cheap and hard to track. A small token placed on a sill could be both warning and invitation. Those who paid attention after the first nights learned a new language of small precautions. They checked thresholds when gutters filled and set lights on timers. They carried a stone or a recorder, a habit that made them feel less open. They learned how easily ordinary objects could be used to remind someone they had been thought of: a mitten on a mat, a child's shoe facing the road, a note tucked beneath a doormat. The stories persist because they speak to something human and terrible: how little it takes to alter a life and how patient attention can rework the ordinary until you move like a shadow through your own days. They persist because rain is patient and because attention, when practiced, leaves a map. If you listen while the gutters breathe and the rain pulls at the eaves, you can still hear these small disturbances stitch across the night. They are not dramatic in the way a scream is dramatic. They are methodical and quiet, a signature that fits under a welcome mat. Stay safe tonight. Check porch twice.